Good morning, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to another episode of Coffee and Something Stronger. My name is Cody Norrid, the Interim Executive Director at Georgia Interfaith Power and Light. Coffee and Something Stronger is a coffee chat style interview show where we sit down with practitioners, faith leaders, and other justice leaders in the world of climate, faith, environmental justice, and the other justice issues of our time. And today, a special treat, a friend and colleague in this work, Lindsay Harper, who is now the Arm in Arm National Coordinator. Lindsay, thanks for joining us this morning.
Thank you for having me, Cody, and congratulations to you.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Of course. Could you say a little bit more about how you got into this work and the work that you're doing now? We'll dive into Arm in Arm a little bit later, but more about your journey.
Sure. So that is a loaded question. I will say that I am, proud and honored to be part of a family that has a tradition of community service, education, of firsts in many of their fields, professional family. Very privileged to be able to continue to add to that legacy through my work with environmental justice, and essentially environmental justice being the civil rights call of our generation today. I am from Atlanta, Georgia, and my mom used to work for the Environmental Protection Agency, and she used to do environmental justice. And so that's my entry into environmental justice. It's my understanding of environmental justice that, my mom was driving off to small towns, talking to community members, talking to the powers that be, really trying to keep people as safe as possible, and utilizing the law to do so, even when industry has the upper hand with influence, with money, with infrastructure. So learning that on the back end through the eyes of my mom as a child, seeing her do the work, now standing where I'm standing doing this work today in 2020, I understand and appreciate her. That's pretty cool. My grandmother was also the first Black teacher at Central High in Little Rock, Arkansas. And so, these are the kinds of batons that I carry with me when I wake up every morning and do the work with Arm in Arm.
That's awesome. Thank you again for being on. I'm excited to dive into this.
Yeah.
So normally I have somebody offer reading, but I think you've got a quote to kind of ground our conversation this morning.
I do.
I ask you to offer that.
Sure. So I, again, standing on strong shoulders, had the honor to be able to hear from Dr. Robert Bullard the other day on a call. One of the fathers of environmental justice movement, and said something so clear that really just made so much sense, and I think hit the nail on the head, and said that, the United States is segregated and pollution is too.
Yeah.
That was really well said. You don't need all the data. You don't need all the bluster, fluster legal. You need just truth laid out plainly in simple terms.
It's very succinct.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit more about that, what that means, why you chose that, and why it's true?
Oh, we are at a moment in time in this country, and more is possible now, and people being able to see the humanity of others, and mainly Black people in this country. And a lot is possible. And there are some things you cannot dispute. I say this often, facts are the enemy of truth. Think about it for a second. Facts are the enemy of truth. Okay. The whole legal system is based on, you have a set of facts and you can argue as to what those facts could mean, right? And so often in so much of the analysis and the data that have brought us to our current statutes and policies that are to govern industry and the safety of people, we've left out the important factors of people in that equation. I've never felt very confident in the equation that industry has come up with, this safety, we know all these things and we have all these certain certainties. It's just not true, Cody. It's just not true. It's in the data, it's in the numbers. The numbers may say one thing, but again, facts are the enemy of truth. When you leave out and only look at the numbers and you're only looking with a certain ideology and a certain way of valuing people, whether you know it or not, you value profit over people. And some people explicitly have valued profits over people. These industries are just a reflection of that. And built into that reflection of that ideology, Black people, Indigenous people, low wealth communities are bearing the brunt with their bodies. And in places like Georgia that have, as you know, nuclear power plant Vogtle, first new nuclear construction in this country in 40 years is happening in Burke County, Georgia. The environmental facts aside, if it were just about science, we wouldn't be having this conversation. But the money that's going to be hoovered out of our pockets, multiple generations. So stepping back, a national conversation that has not been had around pollution and around energy is the nation coming and say, hey, Georgia, we need energy. Y'all got Plant Vogtle. Y'all in Burke County, y'all are going to have to pay with that with your bodies, and all of the Georgia Power customers in the state, you're going to have to pay with it with your pockets, you and your kids, and probably your kids' kids too. Y'all good with that, yeah. Georgia? Has anyone had that conversation with you, Cody?
No one's had that conversation with me.
So.
Okay, well, I'm going to dive into some nuclear stuff in a bit, but before we get there, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you a little bit about your journey of faith and how that intersects with kind of your life path. You can answer this however you want, but I guess how has your journey of faith shaped the way that you think about climate and environmental justice, or the ways in which you work with faith communities?
So in my own journey of faith and understanding that my pathway was one to follow that wasn't necessarily outlined before me, but it had to reveal itself as it happened in real time. So my journey of faith is understanding that I'm able to thrive in uncertainty. And here we are in 2020, yet another year of uncertainty, doing work with Arm in Arm that is evolving in real time with where we are, how we are, what we have to do. My journey of faith has allowed me to understand that while I am a Black woman from the South and all the glorious things that come along with that, there are also a lot of challenges that come along with the intersections of that, and then how my life is then impacted by those things. And that being true, there are also some privileges that I hold. And so being able to really understand and see myself in the larger whole and seeing the places where it needs to be me, Lindsay Harper, that steps into those spaces to live into my calling in that space, and or the times when I step to the side to allow for someone else to come into that space, right? So it's kind of like this dance.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for that.
Sure.
Well, let's talk about the path that you've traveled then. Before you were at Arm in Arm, you were the executive director at Georgia Wand.
Yes.
And in that position, you did a lot with nuclear, which you've already mentioned.
Yes.
And so I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the work you did there with nuclear, kind of the ways in which, I guess two different things, the legacy of nuclear energy and how some of that is contaminating some of the communities that you have worked with in Burke County and otherwise. And then also let's have a conversation about Plant Vogtle.
So I mentioned to you earlier, my mom used to work for EPA. And so I understood that industries targeted small communities, Black communities, Indigenous communities, and they did that around the country, and they did it on purpose. Going into Georgia Wand with that knowledge really allowed for me to take in the breadth and depth of what plant vogel really means in the grander scheme of our, excuse me, our energy economy, of our militarized economy, the connections, the ideology of profits over people, of the inherent white supremacy of the industry in itself. So working in Georgia One really helped me to understand working from the grassroots perspective, working in community in Neighborhood Planning Unit V in the city of Atlanta. City of Atlanta, for folks that don't know, is broken into neighborhood planning units. And so the office was in Neighborhood Planning Unit V, V as in Victor. It was a great place. It's in downtown Atlanta. It's right down there by the old Turner Field. I really had an opportunity to work with community, do work in the local like school, elementary school, work with the folks at the school, work with parents, do issues education, where I got to learn myself all the various ways that the decisions that our Georgia Public Service Commission was making, and how, and at multiple touch points in people's lives, that people I don't really think still understand how they are impacted and what they can do to change our current state, and the potential of where our state could go when it comes to energy going forward. We're talking about climate change. But that being said, Georgia One really gave me the opportunity to understand the implications of what an extractive energy nuclear economy looks like in the state of Georgia, in the city of Atlanta, and what it looks like in Burke County, Georgia, where the plant is actually being constructed and being expanded. Learning from community members in Burke County who have lived there for multiple generations and who understand on that particular piece of the Savannah River, any nuclear facility has to be off of water so that it can take that water in and cool off the nuclear materials. Also having the Savannah Riverside Nuclear Weapons Complex across right on the other side of this nuclear power plant Vogel, having both of these facilities really in very close proximity to one another. Also understanding you've got downwind, downstream communities from both of these facilities, all up and down the Georgia coast, down the central Savannah River area. And we also have a nuclear submarine facility down in Camden County. So just really stepping back and thinking about the level of pollution and nuclear activity and exposure just people in Georgia are having before we have any kind of real catastrophic events that really put us in any kind of danger. And I don't want to be alarmist, but I do want to be honest in saying that if you look at the hurricane maps from the past 150 years, the wind's not going to change tomorrow. The wind comes on the southeastern side. It blows and blows and blows. And when you've got major nuclear facilities in the southeast on that side, it's not really a question of if, it's a question of when, and are we really prepared? And I would say that we're not.
Could you talk a little bit about what are some of the contaminants that people face just every day? So some of these, I know that you've done some work with water testing over there in different communities, and what
Sure.
sort of the nexus of these three nuclear operations, what's actually the risk? What are people actually experiencing over there?
Mm. Well, again, going back to the quote that the United States is segregated and so is pollution. I mean, communities like Burke County are exposed to multiple nuclear contaminants, one of which being tritium, tritium. It is further exacerbated by, it's already in the Savannah River, it's exacerbated by, steam being pulled, from the towers going over the community. It can bond with water and be absorbed into the placenta of a pregnant woman. And if her child is a female, that fetus's eggs are impacted as well. And so we're also talking about reproductive justice. And that's where reproductive justice and environmental justice really intersect. Reproductive justice is the right to have a child, the right not to have a child, the right to be able to raise your child in a safe and healthy environment, and bodily autonomy. Those are the four things. So that third one, being able to raise your child in a safe and healthy environment. Well, living next to a nuclear facility doesn't allow you to do that. And when you're also talking about, so tritium is in the water, we know it's in the groundwater, we know it's in the air. Folks are eating, drinking amounts of this on a daily basis throughout their lifetime. You're also thinking about pollution and extractive economy and who's valuable and who's not. Also thinking about neighborhood planning unit V, where you got 75, 85, and not 20 that are basically cut through NPUV, and kids have real bad asthma down that way. So 75, 85, and 20 are our highways, our freeways, which are now, all that stuff goes somewhere. All that contamination goes somewhere. And so those were the neighborhoods they decided they were going to cut through. It's when they built the stadium down there, same neighborhood. Well, we just need to have this for the stadium. This used to be a thriving neighborhood. Well, we need this now. Oh, this used to be an open market. Okay, now that's going to be a parking lot. You're taking from communities. And
it's
these are
intentional.
Right. And then these are the same communities that now have a high energy burden because of Plant Vogtle, have extra line items on their bills, which means they're maybe housing insecure because they can't pay their energy bills. Oh, so now gentrification is a real thing because people may lose their houses. So people are losing wealth, losing money. So when going back to climate change, if nuclear is going to be the answer to climate change, people need to understand not only the environmental impacts, but the economic impacts of what that actually means. It means people possibly losing their homes.
Yeah.
So these are the intersectional impacts that people are not thinking about.
Yeah. And it adds to, we've said before on the show that, the trick about energy burden is that people are put in situations where they can't breathe, they can't drink the water, for the sake of producing energy that then they cannot afford, and then are pushed out again. And then you add this other layer onto it that it's not even that, because we've talked about there are multi-generational consequences for a power plant that people have to pay for and will never see operate. There are people paying on that plant that will never see it work. And by the same token, there are people who perhaps reproductive systems could be being damaged way down the line. It's multi-generational in a million different ways that we're not talking about those costs. No one seems to care about the cost of the plant in dollars, but they're surely not talking about the cost of the plant in bodies and people's choices.
Right.
Yeah.
Forgive my dog. Excuse me. Please ask me.
No need to forgive this dog. This dog is the best thing that's going to happen to me today. Oftentimes, we've kind of talked about this a little bit, but nuclear energy in the clean energy space is sometimes talked about as a bridge source. It's going to be, nuclear energy is going to be the bridge source that gets us from fossil fuels to clean energy. And we're going to use that period of time to get over that hump. And then we're not going to use nuclear energy anymore. And there are benefits to nuclear because it's very predictable. You know how much it's going to produce in a year. On paper, right? The facts get in the way of the truth, perhaps. And sometimes nuclear is put in the same category as renewables. And I wonder if you would talk about that, and if you'd also talk about sacrifice zones.
So if you have to mine something out of the ground, not renewable. If there's a fixed source, you have to mine, materials to get the nuclear materials to make the nuclear materials. It's not a renewable source, so that's not true. Also, every industry has a supply chain, right? No one ever wants to talk about the supply chain, just the end product. So there is not a whole lot of CO2 that comes out at the end. But remember, if you have to dig up the stuff, you got to move the stuff, you got to transport it, then you have to deliver it, then you got to process it, then you're probably going to have to move it again to get it to its destination. There's CO2 in the supply chain of, creating nuclear materials, whether they be energy or for weapons. So, only looking at the end is really not a true look at all of the facts. But trying to base that as fact is a lie.
You
So,
mentioned kind of the amount of water that's even taken out of the rivers to cool these plants.
so one thing that I think is to consider, there are 100 and some nuclear energy facilities around the country. So let me just say that. So everybody's downwind and downstream from something. You might want to go look on the map. So while this idea about it's someone else's community, it's someone else's body, you really need to be looking at yourself, because there are no borders for air. There's no borders for water, right? I mean, it doesn't just stop at the line because you put a line on the ground. So, and just thinking about, so nuclear energy facilities being next to a body of water, well, assuming that body of water is clean and doesn't have prior contaminants from a nuclear weapons facility across the water, like we have here in Georgia. So no, that water isn't clean. Dirty, contaminated water is being pulled up into the towers at Plant Vogtle and steamed out across the community. So so there are assumptions built into the conclusions that the extractive energy economy, including nuclear and fossil fuel, all of them. There are assumptions built in, and I tell folks often the Hippocratic oath of do no harm is not built into its industry. They have limits on how many pollutants they can allow on the body. How much can we allow on the body is their measure. So this idea that industries will keep us safe, or, oh, they have regulations for that. Well, you need to go and look at those regulations. And you need to make sure that regulations have not been, influenced by those very same industries.
And you know that the system is broken if the system is built on how close to inappropriately polluting a human or a natural source can you get before it's wrong? That's the system. That's the way it's set.
It's over, people.
Yeah.
You said it. You said it.
And to continue on kind of the uncalculated carbon costs. I mean, the massive amount of concrete that it takes to build these facilities to keep them running. And we didn't touch too much on sacrifice zones, but the idea that, you can't just look at the plant here, right? So we've got colleagues in Arizona and New Mexico and other places where this stuff is mined, where it's indigenous communities or low wealth communities who are put on the hook for all the dangers that come with mining and disposing of all this stuff.
And what is so painful is that there's this idea around jobs. People don't, because of our economy, it's like we have to have jobs in order to eat. But if like the only industry where you are is going to in too many indigenous lands, so lands get raped, and then the only opportunities are often to work in those mines, and so yeah, that's difficult. It's hard. It's intertwined, and people, communities, and areas are targeted on purpose. And I think at some point when we get the opportunity to start overlaying some of these maps, you look at mass incarceration, when you look at, extractive energy, when you look at pollution, when you look at health disparities, what I'm saying? When you start looking at stuff, police brutality, it's going to be the same areas going to light up.
Yeah.
You may have other areas that will light up for different things, but you will have certain areas that will light up every time. And that's the map I want to see. And we haven't even talked about coal ash.
Right.
Old stuff is still haunting us, child. And we just want to know about it. That's the bill, whatever the bill name is now. We just want to let us know when you're going to drain the pond.
Yeah.
And that's too much to ask. So when you really talk about holding some of these industries accountable, you see how far we have to go.
I appreciate you talking about the intersections, because it is the continuous profits over people, and pick whatever you want, right? It's not just industry, it's governance, it's policing, it's, however you want to cut it, it's profits over people, and it targets the same kind of people for profits to be over continuously.
Right. Right.
You brought up coal ash, and when we were talking about sacrifice zones, it kind of reminded me about, there are places in this country. You mentioned indigenous lands. There's obviously like Appalachian Voices working with coal communities. There's coal ash communities here. There's Plant Share down in South Georgia, where there's not a lot of other stuff to do. So you work at Plant Share, and then maybe you go home and maybe you pull up contaminated well water because of that. And I wonder if you could speak to kind of the importance of how a just transition intersects with that, why it's important to think about how environmental justice intersects with just transitions and transitioning. Kind of what are the other opportunities for these indigenous communities? How do we make those possible? What are the other opportunities for rural communities?
What I can definitely speak to in saying that there is challenge and opportunity in closing the space between labor and environmental justice. And I think therein lies a real, true, just transition where there really are alternatives. That's the problem. We'll never get to what those alternatives look like if we continue to pour our money, our coins, our dollars, our ducats into the ish that don't work. Okay,
Yeah.
the ish that is painting people, blah, 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 blah. So anyway, I'm saying all that to say that, we have to do the R&D, the research and development in technology that are really true, sustainable, less impact, pollution-free technologies. We have to center workers who are working now. Hey, look, I can't blame you. I'm not going nowhere if you have nowhere for me to go. You know what I'm saying? And so and at the same time, no worker should have to choose between their livelihood and putting food on the table and or having to sacrifice or think about some piece of the labor having to sacrifice. These are not real options. These are the options that were given to us. But the idea is we actually are the true holders of the options. So let us recreate, let us rethink the hows, the whens, the whos. First and foremost, bringing workers and bringing community folks, like folks who live in Burke County, to the table when decisions are being made about their communities where they live. I mean, really, when you say it out loud, it sounds kind of crazy. Not really, but it sounds kind of crazy. It has not happened up until this point. I get money. I get it. But really, you're not having people at the table. How have you gotten away with this for so long? We have allowed it for too long. And now is the time.
Ish don't work.
And so hence arm in arm.
Which is what I was going to ask about. So you mentioned kind of how do we take this power back? How do we be creative? There's always more options than the options that you're given, right? Mm-hmm. So tell us about arm in arm, what it is, what your position is, how people can get plugged in.
So arm in arm, we are working to organize our communities to ignite a transformational era, ending the climate crisis, centering economic and racial justice. We're centering economic and racial justice. That has not been done before. Yeah. That is why we're here. Because it's racism out here that has determined who gets what and how, and the billionaire industries have been hoovering funds and opportunity out of workers' lives for generations, not paying them what they're worth, and then jacking the price up on stuff. It's just really ridiculous. It's just really ridiculous. I'm sorry, I got to take a moment and just really recognize how ridiculous the situation is that we're in. So, arm in arm is different because what we're looking to do is to focus our time and our energy on getting 3.5% of the population to make a move together. That's what we're working to do. And so we're looking to do it through sustained acts of disruptive humanitarianism. Disruptive humanitarianism. I still mess it up to this day. Can you say it, Cody? Say it 3 times fast.
Disruptive humanitarianism. Is that what we're saying?
Yes.
Will you tell us about what that means?
Yeah. So disruptive humanitarianism, to me, is what it means to me when I tell folks. It means you are getting somebody what they need off top. And you're doing it in a way that forces a conversation around how is it that these folks found themselves in the situation in the first place. And the greatest example that I always use is a guerrilla garden. You go to a private lot in an area where there's a food desert being where there's no place to get fresh food. You got like a gas station, like an NPUV, neighborhood planning unit V. Total food desert. First thing I realized when I started working there, I was like, where do I go to get food? I had to get on an exit on the freeway to get down to the closest grocery store, okay? The closest grocery store in NPUV was a BP gas station down the street, okay? So you plant some food in an abandoned lot, and you know you're banking on the fact that your police department, whoever's gonna come by and say, y'all can't plant here. This is private lot. And well, then you can then say, well, look, there's no food here anyway. Why is it illegal to plant food? What you're doing wasn't working in the first place. You're looking to amplify the ridiculousness, not a word, of the situation. But really wanting to folks those who are on the fence around this climate thing, looking to pull them off the fence. No longer being neutral, right? But coming over and drawing a line in the sand and saying we can no longer treat each other this way, and our systems have to reflect the actual world that we want to live in. And it allows for people to begin practicing themselves the world they want to live in without having to rely on the systems that don't serve us right now. The systems that allow for a food desert in the first place.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk more about what's the place of direct action when it comes to the climate movement? And how does it link into some of the other reasons why direct action is important in these other intersectional justice causes that we're seeing, that we have seen, that are part of the history?
So, I mean, there is some method to the arm in arm strategy, looking to, build and train the base in phase one, to do more rising actions in phase two, mass escalations in phase three. It's looking like boycotts, work stoppages, when it makes sense to do that. Myself, I'm learning about direct action. I have seen the value of direct action. I know that it works. Lindsay, me personally, and really understanding how to use it strategically in this time and space is what Arm in Arm has really taught me. In that, if you can get 3.5% of any population in any place to move together, you can change your society. You can make change. And so essentially what Arm in Arm does, it allows a container held by values and principles that are arm in arm values and principles, and that it's a container that people can use, but then also customize to where they live, so that you can have a local conversation around a local climate situation, intersection, or wherever that may be, and utilizing the practice of direct action to bring awareness to what you're saying and to help bring people off of the sidelines so that people can begin to organize themselves and again get in the practice of moving together and saying the same thing essentially with that container, right? It's specific to your area, but essentially saying we need a new way of life. This is not working. We need climate action now. And again, it's wanting to draw attention to our strategic objective is ending the climate crisis. I think that's really important to really come back, a little bit more measurable. We can't end the climate change tomorrow. That's not the goal. The goal is to get policies in place that protect people and put things in place so that people can thrive and that the planet can thrive. So in order to do that, we have to end the climate crisis. And that's why we need 3.5% of the American population.
Can you talk a little bit about that 3.5% number, where that comes from, how that became to be part of the plan?
So now, see, you calling me on it. I don't remember the woman's name, and I feel bad. I have to go back and look at my notes. There's a particular woman who wrote a particular book, and she had gone back into multiple successful movements in history in the past and was able to really do the work and the research and find that 3.5% is the magic number. And, it doesn't, large, small societies, even, various levels of, I'm going to call it oppression. Oppression shows its face in many ways. And I would say that we have an oppressive economy right now, one that is not kind. It is a violent economy. And people under the, the guise of the pandemic we're having right now are
Yeah.
really seeing and understanding their real true vulnerabilities and the vulnerabilities of others, in a way that I feel like people are able to see folks as humanity. And I'm
Yeah.
hoping Arm in Arm will help people to begin to implement and to exercise and to operationalize humanity. It's disruptive humanitarianism, you know?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's great. We're coming towards the end of our time, but I have a couple more questions that I want to get through before we have to
Okay,
part.
sure.
Um, we've talked a little bit about this, but we are in a season of politics and policies, and we will move through this fall, and we will be back in January, which will be the legislative session for Georgia, whatever that looks like.
Mhm.
And I wonder if you could talk about why it's important for people to get involved in the policy space, why that is
Mm.
something that people should do if they want to push on systemic change.
The reason that our policies don't serve us is because we're not represented. We're not at the table when the policy is being crafted. We're not talking to our elected officials as the things they need to consider when policies are on the table. We're not telling our elected officials, after having really known how the policy will impact us and really, being able to get that understanding, what policies to vote for and which ones not to vote for. Matter of fact, I was on a call the other day, and this person was saying that, sometimes the policy person, no one just told them. No one told them. You know what I'm saying? That no one told
Yeah,
them something was going to impact a certain group a certain way, or to consider certain things. And so, and that's one thing that I can definitely say that Georgia Juan gave me was the experience and the opportunity to speak to elected officials. They really don't know. They really don't know. They don't know. You have to go and tell them. They can't come up with the stuff. They're just people. You know what I'm saying? Cody, there's all kinds of stuff you could tell me about Georgia that I wouldn't know, because you don't know what you don't know, you know?
yeah,
So, hmm that would be my greatest advice, is to please educate yourself. Please talk to your elected officials. Please hold accountable your elected officials. Please do your research when it's time to vote for your elected officials. And really think about the systems that we're operating in and what it's really going to take to create the world that we deserve.
yeah. Um, can you talk about too? I mean, as a person who not only has met with elected officials but has testified at the Public Service Commission in some important ways, what that process was like for you, and maybe what opportunities or just the general importance about the Public Service Commission in this state, why that's important.
There are some things that can only be heard from someone who's been there's mouth. You know what I'm saying? Um, it's the difference between an email and a phone call and looking someone in their face. Um, I asked you the question earlier, has anyone come to Georgia to ask you how you feel about paying for the energy future for the entire nation? Like, no, tell me to my face. Tell me to my face. Rationalize it to me in my face and all of my people. That human to human interaction, exchange of energy, exchange of time, space, air in a COVID safe space, hasn't happened. For all the institutional, systematic, gender, economic reasons, we have not been in the same rooms with each other. And so that's really what it comes down to. As a person who I didn't always believe that voting mattered, had never saw myself talking to an elected official or speaking at the public service. Oh, no. And I recognize, again, I mentioned to you earlier about my own privilege. I am fortunate to have an education, and I'm fortunate to have a background in environmental justice. And I felt terrified talking about these things. So it's like, and the only way for us to achieve the win is for people to feel qualified to talk about this work. What they don't need is a PhD. What they don't need is a law degree. What they need is some personal experience and the moxie to go tell somebody what it is. That's what civic engagement looks like to me. And so that's what I believe in power building. That's what I believe in leadership development. You know, like I believe in people speaking for themselves, and speaking often and taking up the space, not only that they need in that space, but the space they haven't had. Like it's equity is in meetings, equity is in protesting. There's equity can show up in a lot of different places. And so one thing I will say, going back to Arm in Arm, I think gives us a great opportunity in this digital age with COVID, is the opportunity for digital activism. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Not everybody has to take to the streets, especially during COVID. Myself as a Black woman, I choose not to go to the streets because I'm not putting my body on the line. I prefer to do the digital space, you know, so that's okay too. There's a lot of power in that too. And I think we've had some examples recently where people have been able to rally in a digital space and get some ish done. So this is it, y'all. We can be creative. We can design the things. We can make it what we need it to be, even down to rating an app with 1 star. You know what I'm saying? Like, I had never thought about that. One of my young people tell me about that. You can rate an app or a website with 1 star, like drive down the rating, you know, so then they don't show up in a search. Like, let's get creative. Let's do this.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And just so many, I mean, like, I never thought about this before, but we talk a lot about the Jimenez principles. We talk a lot about democratic organizing and grassroots organizing. And if you really take it seriously on the individual level, it means that you know what you need for yourself, and that you have to then tell people what you need for yourself, which is this sort of what I would say is like a holy right of testifying, right? And to do it, you're the only person that can do that. So do that with your vote, do that with talking to your elected officials, do that testifying in hearings, do it however you can do it, because you're the only person who can tell that story.
Yes.
Yeah, who can say what you need. I think
Yeah.
that's really important.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for coming on today and giving us some of your time. I really appreciate it.
No, this has been great, Cody. I appreciate this conversation. It's been nice.
So I ask you the last question, which is the same question that we've asked everybody.
Yeah.
What are you missing the most in this COVID-19 world? And what is giving you hope to keep you doing the work that you're doing?
What I'm missing the most is just, I don't have any hobbies. I just like to party. So I'm missing that. But what gives me hope, so I tell people often that this work is hard, I'm tired, and I'm scared. But I can't imagine doing anything else, and especially right now. And I know I'm not the only one that feels this way. And since there is no other option, that gives me hope.
Yeah,
you
have to keep going.
We got to do it. We got to. So let's do it, Cody.
That's great. Thank you so much, Lindsay, for coming on. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in.